And I would like to introduce Patrick Nolan, who is a member of our wonderful advisory committee, and we could not put this on without a bunch of volunteers, and they are the tops. And Patrick also happens to be Rio's editor and publisher. So here he is.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, and it feels like a long time coming for this event. So I'm really happy that Kim and Rio are here. And as Nan just said, it's been a journey for both. So I met Kim over the winter last year, before and after she gave birth to her daughter and son. Sorry, I still haven't met the son. And for any of you who haven't been to the Fine Arts Work Center Friday night events that happen through the winter, you have to check them out because it is like the most warm, engaging, incredible evenings where you get to hear amazing writers engage with incredible visual art and be with the community. It's really kind of an amazing thing. So meeting Kim there was really special, and hearing her read from her novel in advance of its publication was electrifying. So it's so wonderful to see it out in the world and to have her here today reading. Kim Coleman Foote was born and raised in New Jersey, where she started writing fiction at the age of 7-ish. A recent fellow at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, she has received additional fellowships from the NEA, NYFA, Breadloaf, Phillips Exeter Academy, Center for Fiction, and Fulbright, and residencies at Yaddo, McDowell, and Hedgebrook, among others. Her fiction and essays have appeared in the Best American Short Stories 2022, The Rumpus, Prairie Schooner, the Missouri Review, the Literary Review, Quelly, and Obsidian, and Coleman Hill is her very first book. And then Rio, another person who we had hoped to have Rio here last year, just as she was named as a long list to the National Book Award finalists for poetry, and COVID hit her household and we weren't able to have her here. So this journey that she's been on and the escape from the floods to get here and to arrive, just a few minutes ago, basically, is a miracle. So it's so great to have her here. I'm so excited that you'll get to hear her read from her collection, Golden Axe. I'm her publisher. I'm her editor, but I feel like I should also give a shout out to a colleague of mine, Ali Marola, who also worked with Rio on the collection when we were editing, and watching the two of them was an astonishing experience. Rio is just a superstar. She is the New York Times best-selling author of the picture book, The ABCs of Black History. Her debut poetry collection, Golden Axe, as I mentioned, was longlisted for the 2022 National Book Award for Poetry, the PEN American Open Book Award, and was a finalist for the Poetry Society of America's Norma Farber First Book Award. It's out now from Penguin Books. She is born and raised in Salt Lake City. Rio now lives, writes, and works in Harlem. So please welcome Rio and Kim.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks so much for being here. I'm excited to be back in P-Town after a brief hiatus, a couple months. I was just a fellow at the Fine Arts Work Center this past year, and that was an amazing experience for many reasons. I am going to read from my just published book, Coleman Hill, and it's actually inspired by my family, so it is part fiction. But I would also say it's not necessarily nonfiction, biography, memoir, because I did have to bring in a lot of my fictional skills It's based on a lot of anecdotes I heard from my family growing up as a little girl in Jersey in the 80s. My mother and her sisters and cousins would sit around every holiday talking about their family, and particularly their grandmother, who they knew as Coleman, grandmother Coleman. And she literally terrorized them, you know. She also abused them. And they would laugh sometimes talking about the abuse that they suffered at her hands. And I would think as a little child, like, that's kind of disturbing. How could you laugh at pain, you know? And so I'd always wanted to write about that experience and also about the women in my family who were very strong, you know, women who stood up to racists, who stood up to men, who stood up to, you know, lots of things. But at the same time, they turned that strength, you know, onto their children and grandchildren and terrorized them. So I was very interested in that dichotomy and irony. But today I'm going to read from a section of the book that's inspired by my grandfather. This was originally supposed to be about the women and the women's voices, but my grandfather just barged in one day, and I was like, okay, Grandpa, all right. And I think it's really important that I did bring his perspective in, just to give some balance, because he is someone who, as you read the book, you know, he's often emasculated, and so I wanted to bring in his perspective, especially as a Black man, you know, what his experiences are uniquely in the United States. And so this is a section entitled Man of the House, and it's set in circa 1972. And each section also begins with a photograph from my family or an artifact. His ma was barely a week in the ground when his phone rang with Verna on the line. "Jebby, how soon can you come by the house?" she said in her sugary telephone voice. "I need you to remove some things from the yard." A sick feeling came into Jeb's stomach. For the first time since they had moved into their childhood house, it was inhabited by a single person, and she thought she owned it. Verna had paid the property taxes for years now, but Jeb had helped cover the household expenses since he was a teenager. And the deed was technically still in their mother's name. That meant Jeb had a right to the place. He'd used the yard for storage for decades, so why should it bother Verna now? Not wanting to risk her winter mood, though, which could make her go off on you at the drop of a dime, he asked calmly if he could move some things to the basement. "It's full." "Lioness. What about the bedrooms, then?" "I'm using them." "Come on, Verna. Ain't you sleeping in the parlor now? What you doing with both those rooms upstairs?" "That's my business." Hands starting to sweat, he scrambled for an alternative. Build a fence? But that would take too long to collect the wood. The pieces would be mismatched. That wouldn't suit her either. "When are you coming, Jebby?" Her words had taken on that ragged edge like their mother's, reaching her exploding point. "My girlfriends are joining me next week for tea, and I don't want them looking at all this junk." Her friends had been by plenty of times and seen the yard, along with everybody else in Vauxhall, and their mother never called it junk. She didn't exactly offer compliments, but she did once compare it to artwork in a museum she visited over in New York with the family she kept house for. She'd seen a worn mattress stacked with rusted metal parts, an old bike or two, and bottles of different sizes and colors. But the man who created the work in the museum was white, and an artist at that. Jeb didn't consider his things art. They were simply what people no longer wanted, what they thought was worthless. When he'd started working as a trash man, he'd been shocked at what people threw away. The broken chairs and rusted doorknobs, patched tires and dented pots, scrap metal and auto parts, used cans and bottles. So many things that could be mended and resurrected. "Mud didn't mind my stuff," he muttered. "Mother didn't mind nothing her baby Jebby did." There it was, the real reason Verna wanted his things gone. One of her favorite gripes was that their mother had favored him because he was a boy. Jeb could acknowledge that their mother did beat and yell at him less, but he figured it was because their daddy had given him more than his fair share. And it was natural for their mother to defer to Jeb about matters after their daddy died. Jeb had, after all, become the man of the house. He tried to get Verna off the subject by proposing the fence, but when she hissed the word junk again, their conversation dissolved into yelling and cussing, with Verna dropping more of her G's. Before slamming the phone down, she said, "I'm gonna get a dump truck over here tomorrow and I'm moving it all out, motherfucker." This coming from the queen of lies, Jeb didn't believe it. Who in God's name does she know with a dump truck? But he never knew when to call her bluff, so that afternoon he rounded up Booker, his hunting buddies, and a former coworker. As they congregated in the yard on Waldorf Place, surveying his life savings, Jeb noticed Verna peeking from the kitchen window at back. Glowering at her, he mumbled for the men to choose items as payment for helping him. Jeb cringed when his coworker, who also had an eye for the salvageable, indicated the brass bed frame, which had turned green. Jeb had found it last year before he'd retired and thought it would work well with his ma's cot. He'd felt bruised when she refused it. He decided to use it for himself, but his woman Faye hadn't liked it either. It distressed Jeb just as much to part with the porcelain sink with the roses on it, which Booker claimed. That sink marked the week his wife Bertha had left him. It had been abandoned on the curb in front of a mansion in Maplewood, and he'd imagined attaching it to the spigot in the basement since his ma had always complained about having to use a pail down there. That spigot was still bare. Jeb had never gotten around to installing the sink after he moved out. As Booker placed the sink in his pickup truck, Jeb comforted himself with the thought that there was no longer a need for it in the house. Verna didn't deserve his belongings. When the pen passed on his bottles, Jim felt some relief. He had a significant amount and many types, including milk bottles from when they used to get delivered, and his ma's 4 Roses bottles. He'd always planned to sell them if need be, along with everything else in the yard. Who knew if and when a depression would come back? Within hours, they had everything loaded into several pickups, including Jeb's. Jeb got in the lead, cussing Verna the 3 short blocks to Bam's Woods. It was the one place he could think to store his things without paying for it, at least for the meantime. His woman Faye had made it clear long ago that he couldn't keep anything in their house. When they moved in together after Bertha split, he'd started stockpiling old Star Ledger newspapers, Reader's Digest magazines, and Sears Roebuck catalogs in the attic, thinking they could serve as kindling come wintertime. He'd also saved more bottles. Each time he went to the attic to add more, he sensed the collection getting smaller, until winter came and the books and newspapers and bottles had vanished. He confronted Faye, who told him she tossed them on her way to work in Newark, where he didn't do trash runs. Jeb raised his hand to smack the matter-of-factness off her face. She, half his size, the same height as his ma, put her hands on her hips and said, "You want to hit me, Jebby Coleman? I ain't that wife of yours. You hit me and you can pack the rest of your shit and hit the road, Jack." She must have been drunk. She never cussed unless she was drunk. Jeb remained enraged, but had to admire a woman who threatened to make him leave the house he paid rent for. She was just like his ma in that way, not at all like his wife Bertha, who had never put up a fight. Somehow, that had always made him want to hit her harder. The caravan of pickups entered Bam's Woods, and Jeb guided them along the footpath the high schoolers, including his own children, had made crossing to the bus stop. From there, he veered into the thicket, his truck bringing down saplings and scraping past maples and birches as he forged his own road. The caravan reached a spot where there were no trees carved with the initials and hearts of teenagers in love, and the men got to digging. As they placed his things into the shallow pit and covered them with tarps and branches and leaves, Jeb told himself it was temporary, but he felt discomfort in his chest. His possessions, removed from the yard, made him feel like he didn't exist somehow. It was like when Bertha had given birth to their first boy, Spencer. Booker and a few other buddies had chipped in to buy cigars, and Jeb had grinned as they said he must be proud. But when he looked into that fist-sized face that was already so much like his daddy's, he'd felt empty. Thank you.
Good morning. That was really beautiful reading. So nice hearing it in your voice. I've been listening to the audiobook and reading it, so that was a pleasure. I'm just going to read a few poems from Golden Axe. A little about the collection. I'm from Salt Lake City, and my family, I'm the 5th generation in my family that's lived there. They went there after Reconstruction or during the gold rush, I think on their way to Los Angeles, but they never reached their destination. So I think one of the questions that I ask myself in this book is, what happens when you never reach your destination? And then that trickles down through hundreds of 100 years in other people's lives. So we weren't raised as Mormon, although Mormonism is really pervasive in Salt Lake City, but it comes up, some of their tenets of faith come up in these poems too. But I'll start with a sonnet called I Learned to Shoot a Bow. It is no River Jordan that flows here between the railroad tracks and the back porch. It's a canal, not unlike my mother, low as it wanna be and fullest when it rains, existing for however long without a name and singing under a timber bridge that we built. We built that. Isn't that our story, to be denied the beginning? I cross the bridge and shoot a sapling bow my grandfather has carved. He helps me aim into cardboard flats stacked against the willow. I guess this is where I am Orion, with 2 birth stories. In one story, I come from a sea god with the forest as my mother, and in the other, I have no mother at all. I'll switch around too. This one is called UFO, for instance. It's about my grandparents are evangelicals, but they loved camping in this part of Utah that's known for strange activity. It's called the Uinta Basin, and they had this experience camping that they came back and at first talked about and then became evangelicals, and that whole story disappeared from the way that they would remember things. So I wrote this poem thinking about things that you know and no longer know. UFO, for instance. When the hole between blue spruce widens and twists into a cosmos, when the wild lilac and campfire atomize and night hangs their smokes across its belly, when in the clearing you are certain you are not lonelier, but there is a lifting in you, where other knowing rises too and divides you from the bone in your feet to the fat round your heart and leaves you surrounded by your own breath you emerge from and watch vanish and think, the night ate your knowing, and how could anyone know anymore? You might as well look out into the clouds of long pine that hang brambled and orange and branches. You listen for howling, but none comes. I'll switch around. I also like to play around a little bit. I think Patrick was at the salon last night and was kind enough to read a little from Golden Axe, but I like to play around with inserting Black women into film and television in ways that I didn't get to experience them. And so I really love Nancy Meyers films. I don't know if anyone's familiar. It's Complicated or As Good as It Gets. It's always a beautiful seaside town, which is nice while we're here, and a gorgeous house that's got impeccable interior design, and it's just white women living their best lives and falling in love, and so this is called Black Lead in a Nancy Meyers film. Aging at all, I want that, and to fall perhaps most honestly in love beside the ocean, in a home I've paid for by doing as I like, drinking good wine, dusting sugar over a croissant, or the stage play I'm writing myself into, aging Black woman in neutral summer turtleneck, known and jogging. Lonesome enough, eating homemade lavender ice cream, the moon blooming through the kitchen window, the distant sound of waves. Learning French as a second language. Votre pâté Marlo, I smiled back, and then, just like that, falling cautiously for my busy middle-aged lover, who needs me but has never truly seen me until now. Our Black friends celebrating with hors d'oeuvres, our Black children growing older. I'll read two more, I think. I'll do one more like that called Black Fraser Crane. If anyone's one of my favorite television shows. It's like melatonin for me, but it's smart. I also really respect it. So this is Black Fraser Crane. As lonely in her overthinking and as forgiven, Black Fraser Crane is a woman in a multi-generational household with more than enough square feet. Black Fraser has a small staff, but she treats them like family. She has a soothing radio voice and reserved parking at both her condo and the office. Black Fraser complains about little everythings, because what is more important than the fine dusting of cinnamon on the perfect ratio of foam to espresso, except the knowing that you, and only you, have the sense to complain? And who else could understand but a sister? Two Black cranes in custom Italian suits, joking about Freud. Isn't this the hardest work? To be happy when you already have everything. To have so much, you give some up, not away, but to the beast in you that just takes and takes until there are no more brulees and no more canapes, just the mind's endless narration. I'll end with this poem. I think it's the penultimate poem in the book. It's called Visiting Whitney Plantation. I had gotten a grant to go to Louisiana, where my family had been enslaved. I took my mother, and we drove, and I thought I would write a whole collection about this experience, but I wrote this one single poem. I think it was just such an overwhelming experience in different ways that it didn't feel creatively productive. It just felt important in other ways, so I kind of let that be. This is Visiting Whitney Plantation. Clouds hanging so low, they almost touch the wooden colonnettes of the big house, the brick, held together by animal fur and mud, fuselage, the hands that formed it. I raise my arm and rub the belly of a cloud. Our tour guide is Black and does not remark on architectural flourishes. I'm grateful and still wiping sweat from my brow. We are in Wallace, Louisiana, looking for our people's names now upon a marble wall of 70,000 first names in no particular order. I sidestep a white man with a camera so that I can take my mother's hand from her mouth and hold it. On the way to New Orleans, we stop to gather Spanish moss. A groundsman opens the gate after hours. He looks softly after my mother and me. Could it be that he is one of us? I fill my purse with moss and unlock the rental car. How cruel the sun must have been to the slave, I think, when I get back to our French Quarter hotel and lie poolside in a two-piece, desperate almost. Thank you.
That was beautiful too, and I love hearing it in your own voice. It makes such a difference. So I guess we're just going to have a discussion here. I can start. Tell me, I guess, obviously your family inspired this book, but did you have a research process? Was it intentional? Did you set out to say, I'm going to research this about my family to write this specific book?
Yeah, and I think I was going to ask something similar, so maybe we could talk about that. But I think both of our works are rooted a little in like the personal archive or the family archive, and so I think it started like that for me. Utah is a place that's really known for genealogical research, if you're familiar. So I was surrounded as I grew up with keeping a family tree, this idea of like keeping a record of who your people were, and that's obviously different for Black Americans, but we still, because we had such a long lineage in Salt Lake, there was still so much ephemera that I grew up around, like my grandfather's wallet when he passed away and all the things it was filled with, or photographs and articles and church testimonies and things like that. And so I think that's what started this collection, and then it's also what I'm using now to continue to write nonfiction. But yeah, I was going to ask about your archival research process.
Yes, and I do know about Salt Lake City. I wanted to go there, and people were like, you go to Salt Lake City? I'm just like, I'm a genealogist, so yes, it's the capital. But I've never been so far. But so Coleman Hill, like I said, the origins were in my childhood. When I used to hear the stories growing up, I didn't set out even to write a book. You know, this was my unintentional book. There's so many craftings going on. All of it is just kind of unintentional. But like I said, I did want to write about my family in some way after hearing all these stories years after years and seeing connections that my family couldn't seem to see, you know, so like they would also talk about certain people getting abused senselessly and then turn around in the same sentence and say, I wonder why such and such is like that today. I wonder why she's an alcoholic. I'm just like, she got her head banged against the wall when she was 5 for no reason, like repeatedly, like, you know, and so I wanted to bring those together because thinking about trauma and how it works, and abuse, and especially within Black families and Black folks who are descended from enslaved people, you know, that whole trauma, intergenerational trauma that we think is sometimes just cultural, like that we act this way or whip our children and are proud of doing those things. You know, so, but for me, it started with a photograph, which is in the book, and I had an assignment during my MFA program to write a story from a photograph, and it was of my grandfather's 3 sisters as little girls, and basically one of them just spoke to me, and she was like, I ain't afraid of that man or his camera, and I was like, oh, really? And then the words just kept pouring, and I wrote down her narrative in just a couple of minutes. And I realized, like, okay, this is kind of the permission that I was seeking, some type of spiritual permission, because, you know, I'm talking about a lot of family secrets and all this kind of stuff, and, you know, do I put that out there? So this was a permission, since it came to me that way, that I felt that was the beginning.
Yeah, I just went to an event with, are you familiar with Robin Cost-Lewis's book? It's also kind of uses photographs, but it's poetry. But talking about that voice that you heard, yes. I feel like that's something that a lot of writers discuss, like hearing that one, like maybe it's like the intuitive voice or whatever it is, but yes. For you giving permission, that's really important to follow.
It was also unusual for me because I have a lot of friends who are poets like yourself, and I know you do other genres too, but I don't touch poetry. Even though there's a poem in here, I don't write poetry though. There's a little bit of everything in here. But I usually, when I'm writing fiction, I see movies in my head. I never really get words, and all my poet friends are like, it's about the word, and I taste the words, and I feel the words, and I'm like, yeah, I never hear words. And so the fact that I heard, I was just like, oh, and it just kept spiraling, like the whole thing just came out like fully formed. Like, so that was a really, really special moment for me, so, yeah. But I did, to also follow up on your other question, I did do lots of research in the archives. I lived in DC like 20 plus years ago, and I would go to the National Archives. This is before things were like digitized and searchable. Now you can just like Google a name and find like newspaper articles and documents. So I did do that, but it wasn't for the book. You know, genealogy was a hobby for me. But I had done that for many years and collected census records and birth records and all that kind of stuff and interviewed family members. And then when I decided, when that incident happened, when the voice came to me, I had all this material to work with.
Oh, that's amazing. I have so many questions about this, because when you're writing biomythography, as you call it,
Yes.
but it's like a genre that straddles life and fiction, like in your family tree, and if you've seen Kim's book, but it's helpful to refer to, are these names of your relatives?
Yes.
Or did you change names, or how has this been perceived by the people in your life?
So I did change the names. The last names are the same, but I changed the first names just for the privacy of my relatives. And how it's been received by my family. Well, no one sued me yet.
That's a win.
My mom's downstairs. She's talking with me. Yeah, so far, so a lot of the excerpts got published over the past couple of years. And so I made the conscious choice not to tell my family that I was working on it before that point, because I didn't want them to come and say like, oh, you can't write about such and such because that's too, ugly or whatever. And so, but I did tell them like when they're about to appear in print, and I sent everyone copies and kind of got radio silence. And so I was like, okay, well, as long as I didn't say anything, I suppose they read
Could be
it.
worse.
So yeah, but I had attended lots of writing conferences over the years where people were writing even memoir about families, and to see like different ways that people were working with it, because I was like, again, I'm putting out other people's secrets. It's not like, but I did write a memoir. In full disclosure, I wrote a memoir that I did try to get published, and it didn't get published. But so I did try to put myself out there. I've done that. And lots of excerpts actually did get published from my memoirs. So I did write about myself. But yeah, so far so good. And I think because I tried to represent everyone's full humanity, so like that character, the little girl who spoke to me, she was probably one of the most demonized people in my family history. Like nobody ever had a good word for her. She struggled with alcoholism. Her kids were taken away. Like they said she had a nasty personality, all this kind of stuff. And, for me, I had a lot of empathy for her, to be able to see her, imagine her as a little girl, and think about what trauma she experienced in her life, And so even with that, I think like even her descendants, hopefully I haven't heard from them, but can't come and say like, oh, you misrepresented, or you trashed my whatever, because I actually show like, okay, where this comes from, and I hope that people would have understanding for her, even as they, her behavior, yes, it wasn't good, but I hope that people would have empathy for her.
Yeah, I think that does come across. I ask selfishly because I'm writing memoir and nonfiction now, and I think giving myself permission to do it is really hard. I haven't received that voice, but I'm writing for ancestor, like the perspective of people who are long past, so it feels a little bit more distant. Yeah. But I still think that that's something you have to reckon with when you're writing about life. Yeah.
Definitely. But have you told? Well, you've written some things about your family here.
Yeah, it's like
so,
they also know it
like,
exists, but have they read it? I don't. They've purchased it, and I think that's very nice.
And that might be a good thing, right?
I think poetry is like, it's just the way that it is non-linear. I think if you're not open to thinking about words that way, then there might be a direct poem about my mother, and she's just like,
yeah,
I'm glad you're happy. I'm glad you're writing. I mean, she's a brilliant person in her own right, but I just don't know that she speaks the same language as the poem.
And that's probably perfectly okay. Yeah. I mean, I heard from a writer whose mother did not speak English, and she published her memoir in English. It's like, my mother can't even read
Great,
it.
perfect, perfect workaround.
So it doesn't even know what's in it. But I think like it's interesting to hear you say that, because reading your book, at least the sections that were inspired by your family, it did feel like very spiritual. Like it did feel like the spirits are with you here, So can you talk about that process? Because yeah. I think I don't know. It's a book that I wrote mostly in Salt Lake, which feels like a spiritual place for me now. I had a hard time growing up there, just for like, I think what are obvious reasons.
make them clearer. So I didn't love growing up there, and but when I go back, I feel like I have this experience of hearing why they chose to stay there, and I still think as an adolescent it was really hard for me to understand why you would choose to stay here and then continue choosing it, like generation after generation. And now I think I think about Salt Lake as like my birthright in a way, and when I go, I think that empowers me to appreciate it as a space, but it's so defined by religion. And so that is something that's inextricable from being there. Like if you are on any address in Salt Lake City, the address is relative to where the temple is. So like if you're on 3rd West and 2nd South, you'd be 3 blocks west and 2 blocks south from the temple. And so I think growing up in a place like that, where there's very little separation between church and state, and people are culturally talking about their LDS faith and their connection to God, I think that also just sort of finds its way into the writing, and just was part of my early vernacular as a kid. I think like baptism and that sort of thing, but on the outside of it, because we weren't church members, and so.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. And what was that experience like, not being church members?
That's part of why it was not fun to live there. I think being Black and non-Mormon are just two things that like push you outside of a lot of cultural norms there. But my family, I have one relative, my great-grandfather.
Yeah, you mentioned.
Yeah, and he was a Mormon. And because he was Mormon, he had published a lot for a Black man in the era that he lived in. And so his publishing records are part of how this exists. They would have him travel and give his testimony on behalf of the church, and they used his testimony to convert a lot of early Black Mormons to the Mormon faith. But they have, religious beliefs about Black people that are at odds, I think, with Black people being congregants to the church. That they had a belief until 1984 that Black people bore the mark of Cain, so they bore that original sin. They weren't allowed to hold priesthood or enter sacred spaces of the church. This was like fairly recently. Yeah. And then their church elders had a revelation, which is something that also happens in the LDS faith. Like you can have continuous revelation. So like God is changing his mind as time goes on. And that's how that changed. So that sort of language also kind of trickles into the book. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If you do go to Salt Lake to do genealogical research, they have a lot of lovely Mormon people who help you at the Family Research Library. And one way that I did continue genealogical research is you're not supposed to contact them directly for projects, but you can. So I highly recommend pulling someone to the side, and they all have different expertise, and you can say I'm interested in looking into my family. I had to go back several times, and I found a really nice woman named Julie, and I slipped my number with a pencil on her card, and she ended up pulling so much information that I would not have ever gotten. It was amazing.
Yeah, I've actually been to local LDS branches, and people have been helpful, but you have to go to the main one because they're the ones that digitize everything. So and I'm looking for Alabama and Florida, which is where my mother's people come from that are in Coleman Hill. My father's side is from Virginia, and Virginia's records are excellent, but for this part they still have the Mormons have actually digitized a lot of those records, but they're held in Salt Lake.
You have to go.
So one day.
I wanted to also ask about, there was a character in your book, Nell, I think.
Yes.
She was like an early cycle breaker, I would say, in a way. She wanted people to think about love in a different way. And so one of my questions that I had asked for you, and love is such an undercurrent of the book, even though there's other violence and intimacies and things like that. But I wondered how love came into the writing of this book and how you feel like it appears here.
Yes. So I'm glad you asked that because even my epigraph, one of my epigraphs speaks about love and combining abuse and poverty and talking about the undercurrent of love. It was really essential because, so Nell is inspired by one of my aunts, and my grandmother was her sister. And so I got to interview this aunt just a couple of months before she passed away, and I was so glad that I did that because I never knew that my grandfather abused my grandmother. So the story that I just read, where he talks about slapping his wife and beating his wife, I never knew any of that, because as a little girl, my grandfather was just this kind of tall, but like very awkward and quiet, man. And I could have never imagined that part of his personality. And this aunt, basically was someone who was like, why do you want to talk to me? I ain't done nothing special in my life. I'm nobody. And I was like, but you're my aunt, you're a comedian, you have this personality, you did things differently when you were a kid. Talk about your childhood. And we spent 2 hours on the phone together, and stories like that came out. And I was so glad because to learn, the narrative about my grandmother, everyone who talked about her, she was a weak woman. That was the refrain. She was weak. She was weak. She couldn't stand up to her mother-in-law, my grandfather's mother, because she basically kicks her out of the house and refuses for her to see her children. And my grandfather did nothing to stop that, right? So now learning this other layer that my grandfather abused her, and that she kept saying, but I love him, I love him, I love him. And her sister would fire back like, but he don't love you. For someone to treat you like that, he don't love you. That's not love. And so, especially since obviously even still today, we have people in relationships, but it's not even just the relationships, it's like our popular media, our songs, there's so many, oh my God, there's so many toxic songs, so many toxic movies that represent this thing called love. I don't think it's love, but they talk about this thing called love, and it's really abuse, it's oppression, it's torture, it's like slavery, it's like so many things, and so I wanted to just talk about that dysfunctional way that people see love, and to throw in that contrast of someone who's refusing to buy that.
Yeah, wow. I thought that character, there's so many names that I know exactly who you're talking about, but I could see how her story could be easily misrepresented to generations of people. I think like one of the service that your book did was like create all these different layers of understanding for these people's lives that could easily be misunderstood or told generationally in the wrong way.
Exactly.
And thinking about what that would be like for you, or like I thought about that, like what if somebody mistells your story over and over, to your children about you. I think that was like a really powerful rewriting.
And I wanted to even contest that she was a weak woman. So there's a section where she gets her say, and it literally starts with she was a weak woman, her children passing that story on. And I challenged that because the thing is, this is a woman, okay, yes, she could not stand up to her mother-in-law, but so could no one else, except for maybe like 2 people. This is someone, my great-grandmother, she was like 4 feet tall, or barely 5 feet tall, very petite. And she had like grown men, like not just her son, who was like very tall, but she had grown men in town just like, yes, Mrs. Coleman, yes, Mrs. Coleman. And she's like this, and they're like, yes, Mrs. Coleman, And so everyone was afraid of this woman, first of all. But the thing is, you are kicked out of the house as a mother, a wife. You have like 5 children, you have no job, you have no income. And no one really knows what happened to her, how she eventually ends up living in Brooklyn. She finds a new man, she has a new family. No one really alive, was able to tell me what happened to her in those interim years, how she got over to Brooklyn. And so the fact that she made it, that she survived, and she did resist in her own way. She did contact her children, she would call them. She had to like call the neighbor because she couldn't call the house directly because, mother-in-law would have answered. But she would call the neighbors, and the kids would like sneak next door to talk to their mom. She would send them gifts, for birthdays and Christmas, and they would come to visit her eventually in Brooklyn. But to think like, so I try to imagine like what her physical journey was, in the interim. And so for this woman to survive as she did, I mean, I'm not saying like, okay, here, look, this is an example. Do you call this weak? How do we make that more complicated? Right? And the fact that some of her children were too young to even witness what happened to her. Like my mother literally witnessed her mother getting kicked out. and is still traumatized at 85 today, you know, and still like remembers like physically seeing, and she can relate the whole incident, right? That's trauma.
It's a very traumatizing scene.
You know, and so, but then her younger siblings who either didn't see it or they were too young to understand what happened, they flipped, you know, and said, my mother left us. Our mother abandoned us. You know, and she was wrong for that. And we praise our grandmother for raising us because she didn't have to take us in. I'm like, she kicked your mother out. She didn't have to do that. She could have let your mother raise you, right? So I wanted to show all of that messiness and complexity.
Yeah, no, it's so fascinating. I think memory is like that too, like, you know, like mythography. But in writing and in researching any family story, I feel like you run into the ways that it's not true or that you misunderstood it. I feel like even, and my mother has a very fond memory of her father, of course, who passed away when she was 4. And my grandparents were in an interracial marriage in Salt Lake City in 1950. So that was, they had to go to Los Angeles to get married because miscegenation was illegal in Utah. And so she has this memory of them having this incredible love story. And then when you're in the archive and you're like, oh, here's a letter from his ex-wife that he left for my white grandmother. This is a more complicated story. And even faced with that artifact, it's very difficult for my mother to come around. Like, she's very defensive about these people that can't say anything. But I think, like, the mythology that you are told or that you tell yourself about who you are is really difficult to unravel, and sometimes it's really heartbreaking to unravel. But also memory is like, what is it? I mean, I did some oral history interviews for some of the writing as I'm writing that in the nonfiction project, and I'll remember them and I'll describe the conversation I've had, and then I'll go back and transcribe it and be like, I did my own, like my brain recently just changed this whole conversation because of all these assumptions, like the ways that my memory is working and intervening. So I think truth is like a really interesting thing when it comes to writing anything, but especially a book like
Indeed.
that. Yeah.
Which is why I'm, you know, very careful to say that it's not like, well, what is the truth?
Yeah.
Right? I'm actually like, you know, asking what is the truth with this book? You know, what is memory? What is even history? Right? Because obviously that's such an important hot topic issue these days, and especially when Black history is under threat. But what is history? Who gets to tell the history? Right? Who gets to star in the history? You know, and for me, it's like everyone is starring in the history because I think everyone's stories are important. And when I say everyone, it's not just like, oh, these are the victors and whatever, but like everyday people, right? You know, the fact that like these are people again who did not think that they were important enough to be in a history book because I ain't do nothing special. I wasn't, quote, educated, which means I didn't finish high school. I didn't graduate from college. I didn't even want to go to college, right? I worked in the factory. I drank. I smoked. I cussed, you know. But the thing is, for me, it's like, well, we can learn lessons from anyone's life, right? Because obviously people write books about animals that speak. They write about beings from other planets that don't exist, right? Mythological creatures. And we learn something from their lives, right? So I think we can learn things from anyone's life.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really powerfully told. I also think a lot about like when you're writing into the absence, like into not knowing something, and some things are unknowable. Like especially when you're going through genealogically, like you hit a wall, especially if your family descended from enslavement, and you hit a wall, and so, but you know that you existed beyond this 400 years. You know that like there's so much beyond that wall. And so I think coming to terms with like, there are things that you can never know, and yet I still feel like there are ways we know them, you know? Like there's other kinds of knowing, like intuitive knowing, and I think maybe that's like sort of what fills in these stories that as you weren't there witness to them, but it's like that kind of, and I think once I mourn all the things that I can't know about my family by design, which was like, it's like a real grieving process. I think it's probably lifelong. I think like trusting that other intuition or that other knowledge that's just like innate in who you are and where you come from is so helpful, like, and so powerful in driving forward the voice,
Yeah.
and all the stories.
I mean, I had to quote, make up a lot, you know, because there was a lot I didn't know. I didn't know why my grandmother or great-grandmother treated my grandmother the way she did, really. I mean, she said things, but who knows for real what was happening. And so, you know, I did go with my intuition, but there was a lot of crafting also that happened because, and I had a writing group who was just wonderful because they read a lot of these sections in early drafts, and they're like, okay, like, we know this about your family, but you need to, like, maybe distance yourself because, but I was like, but I really, really want to know, and I want to try to get it as right as possible because I am writing about my family. This is deeply personal. I don't want to misrepresent people intentionally if I don't have to. Right. And so, but I did have to step away at some point because I realized, okay, there's inconsistencies. If this character is saying this here, then why is she behaving like this over here? And so I had to, like, literally, like, my notes, it's like a mathematical equation. Like, and I just, like, walked around the room mumbling to myself, like, okay, but if this and then that, then why did she say this over here? And if this and this is. And so, but I was able to actually have some revelations doing that. And so, like, one of the ones is that, like you mentioned, Nell, who's based on my aunt. My great-grandmother, I always thought that she hated my grandmother so much was because of color, skin color. And colorism is something, you know, that's prominent in Black families and culture. And my great-grandmother, who's actually on the spine, this little petite, you know, pretty-looking woman who probably had a knife in her pocket and would cut you if you looked at her the wrong way. That's Celia. Yeah. She, I thought she was very light-skinned, and I thought that she hated my grandmother primarily because she was so dark-skinned. But then, during the course of writing this book and asking, you know, questions here and there, I learned that she wanted my grandfather to marry Nell, who was actually darker than my grandmother. And I was just like, wait, that doesn't add up now. Like, oh man, so that throws that theory out the window. Yeah. But then I started thinking, so why would that be? Oh my God. I was like, ugh. But then I realized because Nell was such a firecracker, she was such a, like, you know, like, fierce person, just like Celia. You know, so I was like, oh, maybe she wanted her, because she knew her son was of a certain disposition, and she wanted someone who could, like, put him in check, yep. Right? And so that just opened up a whole new thing that I hadn't seen before. So I had a lot of, like, revelations like that. Again, I don't know if it's the truth, but it made for, like, a really, really fascinating character study and psyche.
Yeah, probably in some way, I don't know, in some ways, like, just kind of, when those things happen, I feel like they can also be healing personally. Yeah. Which is nice. And mindful of time, I don't know if we wanted to do questions? Or
yes. Yes.
Do you want to see
Patrick.
the amateur person moderating, but yes, please go ahead.
You just mentioned the healing portion of this. Can you talk more about the healing nature of writing and going through this process?
And what's the last part?
The healing nature of writing and going through the processes
going through the
that you two
process.
have been through, separately, obviously.
Yeah, lots of people have asked that, if it's been healing. I don't know, because it was a very painful process to write. Lots of tears. There's still sections, like, people ask, like, what are you going to read from the book? I'm like, there's only a few sections I can read because everything else I'm crying, and I can't be crying through all my readings. So I don't know, but I mean, I think there was a certain catharsis, probably. And ultimately, like, it's not necessarily for me, you know, it's for my family, but then it's also for other people who have these things going on in their families who can't see, you know, the patterns, who also need healing. Because I've been through a lot. I've seen a lot. You know, like I said, I made these connections. So it's not necessarily about me, but it's also helping other people see.
And maybe your children?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely for the future generations, because I don't want this stuff carrying on, you know, any further.
You want to stop right there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The buck stops here.
Here.
I have a question.
Hey.
Take off the mask. I know that you have been, for a long time, an academic advisor to very
Yes.
high-achieving, low-income,
Yes, yes.
immigrant students in college with first-gen bringing trauma with them, and I'm wondering,
Yes.
you've heard so many stories and got involved in so many laws.
Yes.
How did that influence how you approach it?
Mary Pearl, thanks for being here. This is Mary Pearl. She was a dean at one of the colleges that I worked for when I was working 9 to 5, writing these books. You know, it didn't necessarily influence like their stories. It influenced me, but I think, you know, so I worked at 4 different universities: private, public, large, small, working class, first generation, wealthy, all kinds of students, racial backgrounds, ethnic, religious. And I think just being exposed, I was already someone who considered myself a really open-minded person, but I had so many biases that just got completely exploded. You know, working with these students, they challenged so many assumptions that I had about specific people, right? And so I think that that experience was just very essential for knowing more people, you know, because as a writer, I strive to embody people who are not necessarily like me, and to make real people out of them. And so to do that, you have to have this 3-dimensional understanding and empathy again for people who are not like you. And so that just taught me so much. And it also taught me so much about mothering, because they were my babies. All those kids that I advised all those years, they were my babies. Yes.
Thank you. This was absolutely lovely. I'm curious about your genealogies. So your genealogists, both of you, genealogy is important in both of your work. What are your own genealogies in terms of how you bring your work and the history together?
Do you want to answer?
In terms of how we bring our work and the history together.
What are your literary genealogies? And then what are your own, who has mentored you? And even how have you mentored yourself?
Yeah. I think part of my literary genealogy might be, like, there are a lot of poets, like Yusuf Komunyakaa, Sonia Sanchez from the Black Arts Movement, but also film. I think I write a lot about film, but in a lot of ways, film was one of the first creative mediums that I was introduced to. I wasn't raised in a household with a lot of reading, and so film is how I encountered poetry. It was through a John Singleton film called Poetic Justice, and I don't know if you've seen it, 1993, but they cast Janet Jackson, and her character in the film works at a beauty salon, but she's also a poet, and so her narration of Maya Angelou's poems are sort of sprinkled throughout the film. And when I was 10, that was the first time I heard poetry. It wasn't through the reading of a book, but I didn't know at the time I was hearing Maya Angelou's works, but I found out later through the help of a librarian, which was really great, my school librarian. But I think that was probably, for me, like, part of my literary genealogy was through the way that poetry came through television for me. And then it just sort of was a rabbit hole after that. And then I think other writers, you know, peers and friends, and in the writing community also help. Poetry is really wonderful that way, like the poetry community, I think, because the projects themselves can be shorter, and there's different kind. I felt very supported by my poetic community, and then my family just sort of saying, like, it's okay to do this, and you should do this, even if they don't fully understand it. And so, yeah.
Yeah, for me, literary genealogy, there's too many to mention. But I talk about Audre Lorde. I actually mentioned them in my acknowledgement to Audre Lorde, who actually created the word biomythography, because she used that for her memoir, Zami. And I read that during my MFA program, probably around the same time that I wrote the first piece of this book. And I was like, uh-oh, what's that? Because I'm not an experimental writer, you know, even though I wrote an experimental book. But I was just like, what, is that some speculative thing? Like, the aliens come from this, like, what's going on? Like, no punctuation. Though I did read a book with no punctuation. Shout out to Bernardine Evaristo's, yeah. And it was amazing. But, it just read like a regular memoir. And I was just like, okay, like, what is that? But then later, hearing how she described that term as a work of literature that combines many sources to create a modern myth, a new history, I felt like that was really what I was doing. So I really credit her for coming up with that term and that process. But also taking it back to Alex Haley with Roots, fictionalizing his family. Margaret Walker, who doesn't get a lot of attention with Jubilee, her novel inspired by her family, who ended up in the same town as part of my family, actually, after slavery. And also Rose Jourdain, who wrote a novel called For Those a Sun Has Loved, which was published, I think, just 3 years after Roots, and she did the same exact thing as Haley, tracing her family from slavery all the way up, and she doesn't necessarily get the attention also. But many others, but those are some, definitely.
One last question?
I
Yeah.
just have a straightforward question. Why are the Mormons so big into genealogy?
I think there's like a real answer to. I think part of they convert people who've passed on, so that's a big part of it. Is that their belief in this, they want their ancestors to reach the celestial kingdom, and in order to do that, they have to be baptized after they've passed away if they weren't Mormons. So I think part of the record keeping starts with that sort of attitude about bringing your family tree and your ancestry into the celestial kingdom with you when you go. So I think that's, yeah, short answer. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Kim and Rio, for powerful readings, incredible revelatory conversation, just wonderful. So thank you so much. Jeff from East End Books is selling their books in the room just over at the front of the ship there, and so please have a chance to go get your copies. And thank you all for coming, and thanks again to Rio and Kim.